Hi everyone, today I have with me Charles Jennings, founder of the 70-2010 Forum. Charles will be speaking at our upcoming conference, Corporate Learning Week Europe, happening June 2nd through 4th in Barcelona. Charles, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff.
So let's just get started. So when you implemented the 70-2010 model as the CLO of Reuters in the early 2000s, most companies at the time thought of training as something that needed to occur in an instructor-led classroom. So can you talk about how those conventions have changed among L&D leaders in the last decade or so?
Well, I think there's been a huge change. First of all, I think we understand that learning is not necessarily training. That training is one aspect of learning, one aspect of development. In fact, I always said when I was Chief Learning Officer, I said, despite my title, I'm not really terribly focused on learning. I guess I'm focused on learning, but it doesn't really light my fire. But I'm passionate about performance. And I think that's one of the things that has changed over the last 10 years, in that we've moved this focus from thinking that learning was training or schooling to learning being linked to performance. And so we're looking from process to outcomes. And certainly when I took over my role at Reuters and we decided to implement 70-2010, use it as a framework in which to really transform the learning function, and it was there was a lot of many millions of dollars, pounds, dollars involved in terms of the overall training budget. It helped us take a step back and think about how people learn and the best ways, not just the efficiencies, but also the effectiveness of learning. And I think that's what's one of the major changes that I've certainly seen in the last 10 or 15 years, is that there's not always this knee-jerk reaction, although there is still, unfortunately, often a knee-jerk training reaction when often managers will say, we've got a training problem, to which I've always said, training is not a problem. Training is one of the solutions, one of the potential solutions that might be brought to address a problem.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I think that has emerged kind of in concurrence with this popularization of 70-2010 as a model for learning organizations and for companies in general as a performance strategy, as you mentioned, is this idea of the importance of informal learning or informal training, that kind of on-the-job, just-in-time aspect of learning and training. So I know learning leaders often talk about how that's something that's really hard to measure and quantify, but with this greater emphasis on measuring learning outcomes because of tighter budgets and this coupling that with more recognition of the role that informal learning plays, how are organizations able to quantify the effects of these softer forms of learning?
That's a question that I often get asked. And I think it's actually a misunderstanding because, well, first of all, I don't like the term informal learning very much because it implies that it's just happen chance. There's no way in which we can be much more focused around it. But I like to use the term workplace learning, learning in the workflow, using social and workplace learning and so on. But to your point around measuring it, I would argue that it's just as easy, in fact, often easier, to measure the real learning that occurs in workplace and social informal learning than it is to measure structured learning. Because what's measured in structured teaching and learning and training often is got nothing to do with learning. So if we look at the standard ways in which we measure structured learning, we do the happy sheets, we measure the reaction, we use the first two levels, for example, of Don Kirkpatrick's model. So they measure Kirkpatrick 1, the reaction. That tells you whether the experience was good. One could be cynical and say it tells you whether you had a nice lunch and whether the person standing at the front was a great actor. But it may be a little more than that. The second level, which is taken as learning, is often assessed by some sort of post-class test. And we're seeing it actually, we see it a lot in e-learning, where people undertake a pre-test and a post-test. And the assumption is that learning has occurred, and that's not the case. What's occurred there is short-term memory retention. So if we're assessing real learning, and by learning I mean behavior change, That's how I would describe learning. If you don't change your behaviour, you don't do things differently to the way you did them before. You haven't learned. So if we're going to measure real learning, i.e., behaviour change, the only way to do it is to observe people in action, and so measuring them in terms of how they're doing their jobs differently, whether they're able to carry out tasks, whether they're able to do things that they couldn't do before. Now, actually, it doesn't matter whether the process you've been through in terms of the learning process has been structured training, classroom, e-learning, whatever, or whether it's been a tough experience, some social interaction, whether it's been, I always say that adults learn in 4 essential ways. We learn through experience, practice, conversations, and reflection. And it doesn't really matter whether those things are happening in a structured way or an unstructured way. So I would actually counter the argument that it's difficult to measure informal learning to say you need to measure the right stuff.
Right.
If you're measuring the right stuff, it actually is not terribly important how people have got to where they need to get to.
Okay, yeah. Keeping on this sort of ROI and measurement bend, I know at Corporate Learning Week Europe you'll be leading a workshop that's titled Analyzing Your L&D Expenditure, Eliminating Waste and Allocating Resources for What Really Counts. And as you mentioned, there is this sort of tightening of budgets in this post-global recession world, especially for learning and development. So you mentioned one of the things with informal learning being, just that pure observation in terms of seeing whether change has occurred in behavior. To sort of suggest that real learning. So what are some other steps that companies should take to analyze their learning and development spend and then take away those wasteful practices?
Sure. One of the things I'll address in that workshop is really looking at how we commit our resources and how we address the problems that we have in terms of learning and development professionals, and how we can assess both the efficiency and the effectiveness. And I think that efficiency is extremely important and even more important in recent years. I think there's a lot of what I'd call busy work that occurs in learning and development departments. We don't sit back and reflect about how efficient our processes are, whether we're doing the right thing to get to where we need to get in the most efficient ways. And in fact, again, one of the things that I found with working with Sony organizations using the 70-20-10 framework, I've not found one that has found, certainly over a period of 2 or 3 years, found that it hasn't reduced their cost base. And in fact, I've seen organizations where the cost base for learning and development has been dramatically reduced, more than 50% reduced. And what's being done in terms of the senior executives in the organization feeling that they're getting a better service than they were before. So I think that's quite important in terms of thinking about, when we're thinking about eliminating waste, is thinking about the most efficient ways in which we can build capability and support capability in our organizations, and aligning that with the most effective ways we can do it. So there's no point doing it unless it's going to have impact, and there's no point doing it if the cost of doing it is just so high that you can only do a very little bit of it. So it's a matter of balancing those things off.
Yeah, definitely. I also want to talk about, dive a little bit more into, you'll be doing a keynote that is, the title of that is 70-20-10 and its implications for the future of learning and your organization. So we're discussing different things that L&D leaders can do in implementing this strategy and this model, but I'm wondering, from the perspective of the L&D leader, how does their role change when you implement the 70-20-10 business model?
70-20-10 makes the learning leader's role larger. It also has demands in terms of capability and skills. And I've written quite a lot around this. I'll talk around it in Barcelona. It demands, as soon as you step out of the model of a learning professional being a designer, a developer, and a deliverer of learning content, and steps out away from carrying out, for example, training needs analysis to carrying out performance analysis, to understanding problems and using processes to solve problems, it actually extends the role significantly. It makes it, first of all, more strategic. Mm-hmm. It makes it potentially more impactful, but it also means that we require different sets of skills. We still require those skills that we've always had in terms of designing, developing, and delivering really good, tight, and impactful training and structured learning. But, for example, I can't see how any learning professional now really can do their job properly without understanding social media to a certain extent, not to the extent of being an expert in social media, but understanding the potential and when it can be applied. As I say, I can't imagine any learning professional doing their job properly without really understanding both consulting in terms of performance consulting, but also understanding their stakeholders. And in my experience, most stakeholders, whether you work in a commercial organization or you work in a government department or you work in a third sector organization, you will be driven by numbers. You'll be driven by your P&L. You'll be driven by, by the financials. And I often say, if a learning and development professional cannot read a balance sheet or a profit and loss analysis, they should really go away and learn that pretty quick. Mm-hmm. So that's just a few skills. So I think that, again, I'm often asked whether 70-20-10 is actually reducing the value of learning professionals, because they say, hey, you're telling us that we're only value is only that small bit. I usually don't like to talk the numbers because it's not about the numbers, but it's only that 10, it's only that small bit. And the answer is, well, sure, the evidence seems to show that the structured development in terms of impact, when we look at high performers, the impact in terms of helping them get where they are, that structured development is important. It's very important when you start out. It's very important when you're new to the organization or new to a role. Less important once you're a veteran in an organization in a role. But that piece of the L&D role is relatively small. But the opportunity is to look beyond, look over the wall into that other 90 and all the other things that can be done. So, again, I would turn it around and say that for smart learning and development leaders and chief learning officers and their teams, actually there are huge opportunities here. Real opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've taken a lot of your time this morning, so I want to ask just one final wrap-up question, sort of a future forward-looking question for you. I know it's hard to prophesize about the future, but as you mentioned, in the last decade, there has been this sort of dramatic shift in how L&D leaders see their roles, or hopefully are seeing their roles, from this person who's just extolling training to someone who really is improving individuals' performances. So looking to the next decade, how do you see the L&D field continuing to change and evolve?
Yes, as you say, making predictions is fraught with problems. But first of all, we know it's going to change. There is no doubt that there will be change. The question is what that change is going to be. I think that there's going to be a number of changes. There will be changes. We've already seen the change, the moving from training and schooling to learning. We're going to see the move, I think, the role moving from learning to performance. We're going to see the role becoming much more strategic in terms of not just supporting performance, but supporting productivity and supporting key objectives, much more close linkage with organizational objectives. It's going to be much richer, I think, richer not just in terms of, as we've been talking about, technology, but richer in terms of the solutions that we can help carve and help bring and support our key stakeholders. So I think I'm very positive about it. I've seen a huge change. I've been working in learning and development for almost 40 years now, and I've seen lots and lots of changes occur. And I think the next 5 years we'll probably see as many changes as I certainly have seen in the last 40.